All right, so hopefully you're kind of mid lab. So the things that I wanted you to do, if you kind of understood the instructions, is I wanted you to start working through the lab. The first step was to fix app.yaml. That was easy. The next thing is I wanted you to go ahead and get the code typed in for the models.py. If you haven't done that yet, you can go ahead and pause it. But I wanted to talk about it now that you've kind of looked at it a little bit and typed it. So first off, I wanted to look at this figure we've got. So the way that I decided to set this up is with essentially two entities, one for the player and one for the game. So the player was important this time because we keep their display name. So like one person was called Dave in my example last video, the other was called Rose Fisher, I think. And so there needs to be a name that's stored with the player. And then to be honest, the other one is game, and the game is what stores most of the information. He stores two key properties, one for each player that's in this game. He also stores two lists of scores, one for the person who created it, and then the other for the invitee. I chose my variable names. I'm sure you would have chosen, completely different names. The other one is the last touch date time. This can just be nice because I use it to display some time to see when the last time this game was modified. And then this last one is kind of interesting. It's a Boolean property for is complete. This is technically unnecessary, right? Because you can always look at the scores and you can figure out if the game is complete. But that's slow, right? And you'd have to do that math every time. And eventually you're going to have, thousands of games if you love it, right? And so we wanted to keep one simple property that just tracks whether it's complete or not. And actually, the app in its current state, if you go to like the completed games, it just says under construction. Then I'll work on that. But this is going to make a tremendous time savings. So data store models are not about extremely small. This one Boolean is going to save us a ton of computing time. And that's a common trade-off in software development is storage versus time. And this is a clear case where a little bit of storage goes a long way. The other thing I wanted to talk about were the parent relationships that I chose to use here. Interestingly enough, I designed this data store model, and then I went and implemented it, and it worked fine, and I stopped there. But I stopped to look, did I ever actually use this parent relationship? And it turns out the answer was actually no. And that's because the parent relationships are really good if you want strong consistency. So if like you're doing a query and you've got an ancestor, then it'll guarantee strong consistency. It turns out that most of my queries, since I don't care if you're the creator or the invited player, they don't use an ancestor anyway. So it turns out that if I had wanted, I could have actually just gotten away with two root keys. I could have not even messed with this guy. To be honest, I did that just out of habit because after Grade Recorder, I just kind of got in that habit of anything this guy makes, put it under him. So when he makes his own player object, put it under him. Turns out I never query for player because I only care about like the one player that's you or the one player that's your opponent. And then I just went ahead and if he makes a game, stack it under him. And there's no problem with it, but it did turn out that I could have simplified my data model. And I thought about going back and fixing it, and then I decided to just leave it. I'll just kind of show you that it doesn't have to be perfect to work, right? Maybe that's a good slogan. It doesn't have to be perfect to work. The other thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to just kind of look at the code that we added and make sure you understood all the details here, right? So we've got a player, we've got a game. I haven't done this before, but I chose to go ahead and put a method on this class as well. I mean, it's a Python class. It can have methods, right? There's nothing stopping you. Turns out before I haven't chosen to do that, but I had a method on here for getName that it just made the most sense just to put it right on the class. And what it does is it gets the best name available. So if the display name is available, then return it. But if there is no display name, like that person's never signed in or never set their name, then what it does is it gets the key string ID, which is the email address. It was kind of sneaky that I didn't save the email address in the property, but that's because it was the key name, so I didn't really need to. So I chose to save that property. So I was a little efficient, at least, so that's good. And so this simple method, we just added it right into this class to make it easy to use. So we ended up with only one property for the player, and then for the game we had two keys that point to the two players that are in it. Note that it points to the player itself and not the user object. We have two variables for score. The important thing here is, repeated true, right? So that makes them two lists of integers in this case. It was nice we could use integers. Last touch date time, which is just kind of minor benefit. And then this is complete. And you can see we chose to use the default of false. So when you make a game, it's not done yet. You just set that as the default. And this convenience will make our queries quite a bit faster. So this is the data model. The other thing I wanted to do is I just kind of wanted to walk you through the app, just because I think that these apps, like Grade Recorder and this one, they're useful for learning about data store models. They're also useful for how you make big web apps, right? So you can see that the same as before, he's got a main.app, and that main.app, if you want to go look at it, it's in main.py, and it's got all these tuples, right? So this path uses this handler, this path uses this handler, and you can see that there's a play handler for the main game that's kind of sorted into the game handlers area, and then there's things like set display name that's sorted into the main handlers area. So it's the same concept as before. And then I've got handlers kind of organized into different modules. The modules are put into a package. The package is really just a folder which has this underscore init underscore .py in it, and presto, it's a package. There were enough utils this time that I made a separate utils package with various util modules inside of it. But other than that, the app should be things that you recognize. So make sure you finish models.py. That's what you should have done like before watching this video. But now we're going to do some of the next steps together, just because I think if we do them together, you'll kind of get more out of them. So there's 5 different files that we're gonna work in. The next one we're going to work in is utils, player utils. You can see that there's a to-do in here. What I like to do with my to-dos is I like to just copy them, change them to done instead of a to-do. And then that way I've kind of got the reference for what was I trying to do. So I'm trying to create a player that has the ID, email, and the parent that uses a function called getParentKey. So that's not actually that hard. I just went ahead and typed it here. So I'm creating a player. So I use the player constructor. In order to implement my data model, so my data model says that he has a parent that points to this entity of the email address. To be honest, if I looked at my code, it turns out that this was actually not necessary. I could have deleted it. I'm going to choose to leave it. And then this part was important. He has an ID, so we're using a key name trick here, that is the email as well. So if I want to get a player, all I have to know is their email address, and then I can easily fetch that player, which is a nice trick. So that one's done. That one was fairly simple. If you follow along in the lab, you can see what's next. I think next up is going to be in handlers, the game handlers. So that thing we just did was for creating and inserting a player. Next, we're going to go for creating and inserting a game. There's actually 3 to-dos in this one. So there's 2 to-dos related to scores, and then there's also to-do for adding a game. So if we're going to add a game, I'm going to do the same trick that I always do. I'm going to say done, and then I'm going to start writing my code. So I know that I want to create a game. A game is going to need a parent. So he's going to need a parent that is the player's key. So if I go back and look at this, he's going to need a parent that is the player's key. If you look at this function, I've actually got player passed in. So in this case, it's actually easy. I just say player.key. So that's my parent. I also want to set the creator key. And that's actually going to be the player key as well, which again kind of shows that there's some redundancy in this model, and I probably could have done without some of these things. I also want to make an invitee key, and that actually is one of the variables that was defined just above. So I'm going to say invitee key is equal to the invitee player key. So that actually is just how you create a game. It's interesting that you don't start with any scores. You don't set that is complete because it just gets the default of false. You don't set the last touch date time because it just got auto added. So the only thing we have to do when we create a game is just say who are the 2 people playing in this thing. Oops, I do have one typo. If you look at the way I did my imports above, I just imported models. So I technically have to say models.game. I could have fixed that just by doing the import in a different style, but do the style, I have to say models.game. And then we've actually got, that's for the new game action. Then whenever somebody puts a score in, we've got a different action handler. And really all I wanted to do here is just show you that it's a list of scores and just how you append to it. So in this case, I'm just going to say game, because that's one of my variables on line 55. Creator scores append, and what I'm going to append is actually just a variable that's above new score. I know it's hard to actually like use other people's variables that are in functions, and so I'm just having you write a very small portion of this. So you might have to add something to the creator, or you might have to add something to the invitee scores. So that's the to-dos on those guys. So those two are done. Then the next one is kind of the most interesting. So we've done the design of the data models themselves. We've done inserting a game. We've done inserting a player. We've done adding a score to the game. The next thing we want to do is getting stuff out, right? So we want to be able to get these things out of the data store. So there's a couple queries we're going to write as well. They're going to be over in utils, game utils. So what I did here, just to kind of clean it up some, is I have a method which simply returns a query object. And so for this first one, what we're going to do is we're going to query to get all games for a player. So we're just going to return, and we want to create something that ultimately gives us games. We're going to say game.query. And then if we want all the games for the player, we want the ones where they are the creator or they're the invitee. You'll notice that we got passed in the player object. So what we really want to do here is we want to look for times where the creator key is equal to player key, or we want to look up, when it's the invitee key. The way you do an or is, we talked about it in that last video lecture, you say ndb.or, and I'm going to go ahead and line that guy up. So if he is the creator key or the invitee key, then I need to make my parentheses match. Then that's going to be a result we'd like to return. So that'll just give you all games. Another query that we might want to implement is we might want to implement the unfinished games. So this is similar in that it's one that's for you, but we only want the ones that are unfinished. So we're actually going to do an NBD and of these two things, right? So my and is going to actually encompass the or, and I'm going to tab it over a little bit here. And what I want to look for is I want to look for game.isComplete equal to false. And you can add spaces on these things. Sometimes I get in the habit of not leaving any spaces, but you can totally add them. And then so we're saying and, so it's game is complete, and one of those two things is true. So that's how we're going to get all the unfinished games. So I think it's really neat to see all these advanced things you can do with queries. And I kind of wanted to talk about this with you. I mean, you can see it in the slides as well, but I kind of wanted to talk about it and run through it with you. So at this point, what you should be able to do is you should hopefully be able to run this thing as a PyDev Google App Engine run, and you should be able to start up localhost. So what I want you to do is I want you to open up two tabs, and then it'll ask you to sign in. I'm going to have one tab sign in as test at example. I'm going to have the other one sign in as test2 at example. So I'm going to log in over here and log in over here. And then what you can do is you can, give this guy a name. His name is test, and this guy over here, his name is test2. Make sure that you did the incognito window trick to actually make that possible. And then what you can do to try it out is you can, see that there's no games in progress, so I can make a new game against test2 at example.com. And then over here, this guy, he can look for games in progress, and I can see that he's got a game against test, and so they can play against each other, right? So he's going to stop there at 200, and then he's going to stop there at 400. and you can see that you can play against each other. Who you are is always on the left. So it's actually a pretty neat app, right? And some neat games you can play. And I find it interesting how simple the data model is for as much as there is going on here. All right, so that's it for the Dice with Friends. We kind of walked you through to the end of the lab there. What we ask you to do is we ask you to submit the URL, assuming you're taking this for a grade so that we know you finished the lab. If you followed along through all of Grade Recorder and through all of Dice with Friends, hopefully you've learned a ton about designing data store models, and these are going to be great skills for projects and things that you do on your own. That's it. Finally done with designing data store models. See you next time when we start a new unit. See you then.